They Killed Him Dead by L. Ron Hubbard. When you see a man standing with a smoking revolver in his hand, staring in sudden terror at a crumpled body, and when you see all this happen, then almost any man would say that it was murder, or at least a killing. Careful Cassidy, rounding a corner, an instant after the shot slapped sharply through the murky street, considered it as such. The man who held the pistol was beginning to relax slowly, sagging with the realization of what he had done. He still stared at the dead one. Careful Cassidy strode up and gently took the revolver from the killer's hand. He met no protest whatever. The light in the center of the street striking the man's face showed a thin mouth and thin nostrils which quivered slightly.
I've killed them.
Careful Cassidy took out a pair of shining bracelets and deftly snapped them to the man's wrists. Then he knelt professionally over the crumpled heap of dirty clothing and felt for a heartbeat. That unsuccessfully done, Cassidy turned the body over and inspected the wound, which was dead center between the man's eyes.
"Stick around,"
said Cassidy to the killer.
"I'm Cassidy from the Homicide Squad, and you couldn't have picked a neater minute for the job, and you couldn't have done it better."
For the first time, the killer seemed to realize that another man was there. He stared down at his confined wrists and then back at Cassidy. For a moment, he must have considered running away, for he stared with some hope up and down the deserted, shabby street. But Cassidy was tough. Cassidy wore a bowler and a cigar and unpressed pants. He wasn't very tall, but he had a square face which scowled eternally, even in his happiest moments, and he had a set to his shoulders which showed determination. The killer did not run.
He attacked me,
cried the man.
I came around the corner and he lunged straight at me from behind that lamppost. He was trying to kill me, I tell you.
"You knew him, of course."
The killer stared intently at the gray, unshaven face of the dead man, noted the worn condition of the clothes and the curiously rigid shoes, and then shook his head.
"No, I didn't know him."
"He looks like a mob gunner,"
ventured Cassidy.
"but that don't mean anything, of course. Supposing you step into this drugstore with me, and let me call in the wagon."
Cassidy herded his captive into the store and called headquarters. When he came out again, he noticed with some annoyance that a crowd had begun to gather. He held them back from the corpse and waited. Soon sirens came and blue coats unloaded themselves and loaded the stiff and the killer.
"Open and shut,"
Cassidy told the sergeant. The sergeant looked at him, remembered Cassidy's reputation, and said,
"If you say so, it must be so. Did you see it done?"
"Not exactly, but I almost saw the stiff fall. Let's go, boys."
They went. When they got back to headquarters, Cassidy sent for the coroner. He was confident of his procedure. It wasn't usual to leave a stiff lying around on the street, and the case, as he had said, was open and shut, and that was all there was to it. All he had to establish now was the motive, if it had been a killing of spite. To that end, he sat down across from the killer and began to fire questions, very careful questions, which showed that Cassidy knew all about his business.
I tell you,
wailed the killer finally.
I didn't even see him there. He just jumped out at me and started to fight. And he had a gun in his hand, and it fell down, and I picked it up. And then he tackled me again, and I gave it to him. My name, officer, is Smith. I'm not the type of fellow that goes around bumping off guys just for the fun of it. I never saw him, and all I know is that I had to shoot him to keep him from shooting me. I'm a bookkeeper by trade. I don't even have anything to do with gangs or anything. He just jumped at me, and I had to shoot him.
Said careful Cassidy, elevating his cigar to a firing angle and looking very careful and wise.
It looks kind of funny to me. But investigation will bring it all out. Yes, I'm sure it will.
He saw that Smith was securely locked in a cell, and then went down the corridor saying,
Humph.
at every third step, and scowling hard as though deep in thought. He met the coroner outside and favored that dapper man who stood twirling his pince-nez upon its black cord with a scowl deeper than the others.
I say, Cassidy.
Began the coroner.
Tut, tut, Brant. Tut, tut. Don't give me any of your foolish theories. I know what I'm doing, and I wouldn't do anything which wasn't right. After all, I've got to think of my reputation. That man says his name is Smith. They all say that. He says he's a bookkeeper, and that must be a lie too. He says the man attacked him, and that he shot the guy with the guy's own gun. But that's a lie too.
But, Cassidy.
But me no buts, Brant. You don't know about these things, and there isn't much use in your butting into this. Stay with your stiffs, and let me the live ones. My reputation is too good to be questioned on this matter. Didn't I practically see it happen?
Yes, but
Well, damn it, out with it.
the fact is, Cassidy, that this man was not killed with a gun. He was stabbed to death with a knife.
Careful Cassidy had reason to blink. He saw then that he had been careless in spite of everything. He should have looked very carefully about the street for other weapons, but then, damn it, he hadn't he? He had everything down in his report, and everything ready for the investigation. And now Brant said,
What was that again?
I said that the fellow was killed with a knife, stabbed 3 times in the back, each of the wounds fatal. As soon as I get down to the morgue, I'll have an autopsy made, and we'll know exactly how long he's been dead.
Brant was beaming, twirling his glasses and looking most pleased with himself. Although Cassidy did not know it, there were many men about the station and the city who would very much have liked to see him make just one mistake. Cassidy's record was far too perfect. His luck was much too good, as was attested this night by fate's letting him step right onto the scene of the crime.
What time did you see this happen?
9:13. Listen, are you sure about those knife wounds? I mean, mightn't they have...
I'm certain. The wounds are rather old. Say, a couple of hours at a guess. He was dead before he was shot.
But, damn it,
Scowled Cassidy.
this guy Smith said that the fellow attacked him. And if that's the case, then, Lord, but the guy must have been dead at the time.
Cassidy stomped back for a look at the stiff which was about to be removed. He saw that the coroner was right. 3 knife wounds, deep and fatal knife wounds, any one of which would have done the job, were very apparent in the man's back. Cassidy was so agitated by this discovery that he merely flipped through the papers found on the dead man. The fellow was probably some petty thief from the looks of his loot, but Cassidy could not find further identifying clue. Scowled Cassidy.
I get the Parsons killer dead to rights. I get the Sanderson case open and shut. I get those dead bankers all solved. I even turned the juice into the governor's killer. And now I have to take a beating from some dumb hood nobody either knows or cares about.
With wrath at such a state of affairs, bubbling and seething like a cauldron of poison in his vitals, he decided that he better go back to the scene of the crime. He did not miss Brant's knowing look as he went out. They were laughing at him. Once again he found the dirty street. At the earlier hour he had been on his way to Mike's palace for a glass of cold beer before bed. But now Mike was forgotten. Cassidy paused upon the coroner and looked intently down at the spot where the dead man had lain. When his first scrutiny disclosed nothing, he took out his flashlight and began to explore the street on his hands and knees. Rooney, fat and big and jolly, walking his beat, came by and stood rocking back and forth on the curb watching Cassidy's antics. Cassidy heard the patrolman's laugh and flushed. He did not reply to Rooney's question. A sudden discovery made him forget all about Rooney. He had found a trail of blood which led straight down the sidewalk. True, it wasn't very much blood, only a little drop about every 5 feet or so, but the flashlight picked them out, and Cassidy followed them in a crouch like some bloodhound upon the trail of an escaped convict. The drops led up a flight of steps, and Cassidy, upon inspection, discovered that he was at the side door of a Greek restaurant. The place looked to be of somewhat evil reputation, if a quantity of dirt and the smell of decaying slops were any indication. Cassidy entered and saw that there were no patrons. Only the owner stood guard, wiping his hands nervously upon a dirty apron and staring at Cassidy out of sucked-in eyes, which appeared to be carefully packed in larded cotton.
You want something to eat?
Nah,
said Cassidy, scowling like a storm cloud.
I'm Cassidy from the homicide squad.
The Greek began to shake. He dropped his apron and began to twist at his mustache.
But, why do you come here? I know nothing about it. I don't know who...
He knew then that he was giving himself away. Cassidy went across the room and took the Greek's arm. Cassidy was scowling terribly until it looked as though his face would explode and spatter the room with screaming fragments. Carefully, Cassidy began to lead the man toward the stairs. The Greek went willingly enough, so Cassidy changed his direction. He went toward the kitchen, and the Greek recoiled as though Cassidy had faced him with a ghost. Relentlessly, Cassidy led on. The Greek pulled back harder and harder. Cassidy stopped, and the Greek relaxed. Cassidy started again, and the Greek drew back. It was a silent battle without any great effort. It was merely a mind reader's trick, getting a dupe to lead the way to a hidden object. The process led Cassidy out the rear door and into a court which looked like a cube of solidified coal smoke hemmed in by 8-foot gray walls. Now the Greek began to blubber, and Cassidy scowled in triumph.
So, this is where you did it,
said Cassidy, prowling about the place and snooping into the corners with his flashlight. The Greek stood in silent palsy, kneading his pudgy fingers, and when Cassidy spotted a patch of blood, he could stand it no longer. He cracked with a sound like a bursting paper bag.
I had to do it.
Yowled the Greek.
I had to do it. I don't try to cover anything up. And it ain't no crime to stay alive like I did.
Cassidy poked methodically through the trash and finally unearthed a lethal-looking butcher knife, which he handled delicately, his handkerchief protecting any possible prints.
Now talk.
Oh, I knew there was nothing good coming of this. I knew it. Listen to me. 2 nights now, some fella's been sneaking over the back wall, stealing things from me. So tonight, I'm here cleaning me some rabbits. This fella jumps right on top of my neck. He was 6, 7, maybe 8 feet tall, and he had a gun, and he yelled, "I'm gonna kill you." And he was all over me. What could I do? I got this knife, so I stab him.
A likely story.
He called a wagon on the Greek's phone, and soon the patrol arrived in the Black Maria, and the Greek was loaded in. But this time, Cassidy was more careful than before. He examined the spikes on top of the wall and found a piece of torn cloth, the same color as the dead man's coat. This he took, waving it like a battle flag, and sat himself down beside the Greek in the wagon. Back at headquarters, he saw that the Greek was locked up for further investigation. He did not believe the man's story in full, although the piece of cloth seemed to mean something. But he had at least made some attempt to solve this crime in a proper, careful fashion. Now he had the killer, And that was that. He went down to the morgue and was startled to see that Brant was still there. Brant had a cat and cream expression on his face, but Cassidy disregarded that. Somewhat loftily, Cassidy said,
I got it now. A Greek killed him in back of a restaurant. I never fail, Brant. And that's saying more than you can for coroners. This cloth matches, and that's that. The Greek killed him. And we'll find out the real story behind it in the morning.
Brant, in his white apron, still swung his glasses on their black cord.
By the way, Cassidy, I might venture to say that...
Tut, tut, Brant. Nothing more to say about it. Don't crow over it. Someday you'll regret it. That wasn't a mistake of mine. That was a mere oversight. And I wouldn't have seen it myself if you hadn't...
But the corpse...
began Brant, patiently and sarcastically.
Damn the corpse!
Cried Cassidy in terrible disrespect.
What's wrong with the corpse now?
The time of death was about 6 o'clock. About 6 o'clock. And the knife wounds.
What's the matter with the knife wounds? I thought they were fatal. And now I suppose you're going to tell me that he died from water on the kneecap or something?
Not quite, old fellow. Not quite. You see, the fact is...
Brant stopped and flavored his words with honey.
The fact is, my dear fellow, the knife wounds were not fatal. Could not have been fatal because...
Cassidy felt the sweat starting out of him, and the cigar he chewed drooped.
Go on, damn it!
Because he died from a broken spine and internal injuries.
Cassidy jumped as though stung.
Go on. This isn't funny. What do you think I am? A school kid? To believe all that? Spine my hat. I got the man who did it, and that's all there is to it.
No need to bluster, Cassidy. No use at all.
Said Brant, sweetly.
I have just now discovered that 4 vertebrae are smashed, and the back was terribly bruised. The blood from the knife wounds was not active and flowing. Perhaps it might have dripped a little, but the age of the wounds shows that they were made on a corpse, not a live man. You see, such a wound would bruise, and in this case, there is no bruise about the knife wounds. You can't bruise a corpse, old chap. The spine was broken in a long fall somewhere about an hour before the knife wounds were inserted.
Cassidy heard Brant laughing behind him, and in another's shoes he would have laughed himself. Indeed, the thing was funny when you came to think of it. Impossible, too, but the coroner was always right, and...
The question is...
said Cassidy to himself, drooping and feeling slightly ill, and that somebody was making a fool of him.
The question is, where did the guy get his busted spine?
He took himself back to the restaurant and found that the Greek's wife had taken over. He had nothing to say to her, although she had plenty to say to him in a high, shrill voice which cut like the Greek's butcher knife. Cassidy stumped about the court, pulling up a box, and again examined the stone wall. But he could find nothing there, except that this court was backed by another court. He thought that over. To get into the Greek's backyard, a man would have to go through the house beyond the other court. Therefore, reasoning simply, the dead man must have come out of that house. Cassidy dropped over into the other yard. He was feeling tough again, and he paused to light a new cigar. He set his hat at a frightening angle and thundered upon the basement door. After a long wait, a face peered timidly at him. Cassidy elbowed his way into the room.
I'm Cassidy, of the homicide squad. Who are you?
I am the janitor, and
The small, white-faced man looked very nervous. He was bent over from work, and his face bore heavy lines of worry. His eyes were all washed out. He looked like some cast-off winter coat grown too threadbare for use. Said Cassidy with his best scowl.
What's the matter with you?
a slight chill. I stayed out too late last night, and but maybe you want to see the doctor?
And where's the doctor?
The janitor led the way up a long flight of back stairs. They came out upon a dingy landing. By the light of a small yellow bulb, they could read "Doctor" upon the door at the head of the front stairs. The janitor's nervousness was increasing, much to Cassidy's satisfaction. The janitor knocked. Presently, a tired-looking woman came and told them that the doctor had been out all afternoon and would not be back until late. "But you can wait there on that bench if you want to." Cassidy wasn't interested in benches. He was interested in the janitor. Cassidy prided himself upon his remarkable luck. As soon as the woman was gone, Cassidy confronted the man.
Why?
Said Cassidy in a voice which shook the flimsy walls.
Why did you do it?
A shot in the dark, thought Cassidy behind his scowl. The janitor cringed and looked involuntarily down the front steps. Cassidy also looked. He saw that the railing at the bottom had recently been patched. He went down there and saw that the glue was still wet. He also noted that the carpet tacks were ripped out in 2 places on the stairs. It was very plain to him then.
Come clean.
Said Cassidy to the janitor.
I've got the goods, and you better tell me all about it, and fast.
The flash of a shield and the scowl did the trick. The janitor wilted.
I tell you,
whined the man, all bent over with woe.
that it was all an accident. I came up here to clean up, and when I went down again, I passed this landing, and a man was sitting on the bench, and I tripped him, and he suddenly jumped up and grabbed me and tried to throw me down, but I fought him off, and when I did, he stumbled and he fell all the way down, and when I got down there, he was dead.
A likely story.
Sneered Cassidy.
You murdered him, and I'm going to find out why in the morning. You haven't got strength enough to shove a big guy like he was down those stairs if he didn't want to go. You're under arrest, so come along quietly.
Without further questions, and with great determination, Cassidy dropped his nickel into the pay phone in the hall and called the wagon.
Hey, say,
Said the desk
you
sergeant.
think we got nothing to do but grab up your killers?
There was a slight laugh in his voice, and Cassidy took it ill and began to say things, but the sergeant hung up, and soon the patrol wagon came. Cassidy saw to it that the janitor was locked securely in his cell. Cassidy was beginning to get a little worried about the way he was filling up the jail, but then the occasion seemed to demand such a thing. There was something ominous behind all this, and in the morning, Brant came out of an inner office. He had been waiting, although the hour was late. Brant was smiling again, and Cassidy almost bashed him one.
By the way, Cassidy, you know that man you saw shot this evening?
Can it?
Cried Cassidy in agony. He knew what was coming. He could hear them snickering in the squad room. Careful Cassidy was making an ass of himself, and he knew it.
Well, I'm sorry about my misinformation, Cassidy.
Continued Brant.
I should have made a more thorough investigation beforehand. But you've been so impetuous that...
Damn it! I have not! I've been acting on information you gave me, and...
Words failed him. He knew what was coming.
I was somewhat astonished when I found that there were no bruises to mention in spite of the spine trouble. And so I went to work and took the whole cadaver apart, and I found...
Cassidy moaned.
What did you find?
Brant drew out a dinner ring. It was a cheap affair, set with small gaudy stones. It was big and sharp and green. Brant let it sparkle in the light.
This was in his throat.
In his throat?
Yes, I'm sorry to say that this was the cause of death. He swallowed this ring, choked on it, and then died when it lodged across his windpipe.
This is a joke.
No, I assure you it is not. I found this ring only when I discovered that his blood had rushed to his head and that he had collapsed lungs. Then I looked for the ring, and here it is.
Cassidy staggered out of there. He went to his desk and found that he had carefully saved the papers and the small items he had taken from the dead man. He found, among them, 2 other rings of the same size as the emerald-colored one. He found also a wallet with a dollar bill in it. This wallet looked as though it had come from a bigger pocketbook, perhaps a woman's, in that the wallet smelled of face powder and perfume. It contained a driver's license, which bore the name Emma Lindsay and the address of 224 Spring Street. Cassidy was haggard. They were still snickering in the squad room. Careful Cassidy's reputation was slowly going up in smoke, and it had to be over a bum nobody cared about at all. Why the hell had he ever come onto the scene in the first place? It was getting late, and Cassidy decided that he had better take a taxi. He wanted none of the patrol cars because he knew that the radio cops would laugh at him all the way. He went back into the murky night and rode sullenly to 224 Spring Street. He had the wallet in his hand when he rang the bell. A beefy, red-faced, and overbearing man answered the door. His whole attitude was a threat, and he seemed about to demand that Cassidy take himself elsewhere at such an ungodly hour. But Cassidy, cigar tilted up, and feeling better already, beat him to the draw. Cassidy shoved the pocketbook under his nose.
I believe this belonged to Mrs. Lindsay?
The man's eyes protruded as though pushed out by terrific mental pressure. He fell back from the door, and Cassidy took that as permission to enter. A woman was standing in the hall staring at him. She was as timid as her husband was overbearing. She was dressed in house clothes, which were somewhat gaudy. She was the kind who hopes to hide a timorous heart by a loud exterior.
I brought you back this wallet. I'm Cassidy of the Homicide Squad.
She took the purse as though it were hot. Her husband still held open the door, but Cassidy did not take the hint. Cassidy drew the dinner ring out of his pocket and held it out. With a small gasp, she seized upon it, and then, as though afraid to leave it lying about, slipped it quickly upon her finger. It fitted perfectly.
That's fine,
said Cassidy, beginning to scowl. He drew the dead man's gun from his pocket and shoved it at the man.
Ever see this before?
No.
Shouted the man.
No.
That's fine. Then it's your gun, perhaps?
The woman began to weep. She clutched at her husband's arm and moaned.
We've done nothing wrong. We didn't mean to.
That's all I wanted to know. So you did kill him? Oh, there's no use putting on an act for me. I know all about it. All about it. You're coming down to the station house with me for questioning.
No, wait.
Thundered Lindsay.
I'll tell you all about it. There's no use for your...
But Cassidy already had the wagon on the phone, and he ignored the jibes which came back to him through the earpiece. The driver saw it was Cassidy when he arrived. He chuckled. The driver had a perfect right to laugh, but Cassidy's scowl was horrible to behold.
Still the same corpse?
Said the driver. Cassidy didn't answer that, and they safely arrived at headquarters. Brant was still there grinning. Cassidy planted himself and his cigar belligerently before the coroner.
You find that he was poisoned yet?
Demanded Cassidy.
No, he choked to death.
I'll bet it was poison. Sergeant, get these people out here. I want to do some questioning.
Smith, the bookkeeper, came, followed by the shivering Greek, who in turn was followed by the janitor. All three of them stood nervously in the bullpen waiting for Cassidy to start.
Now,
said Cassidy, turning to Lindsay and his wife.
what happened? And tell it straight, or...
Lindsay began to talk in a heavy voice, but his wife interrupted him.
I was in the kitchen,
said the woman.
and this man came around to the back door and asked me if I had something to eat. He was a big, tough-looking man, and I thought I'd better do what he said, and so I started to get him something. He came in and sat down and grumbled when I said all I had was some bread and butter and milk. He said I better have more than that or he'd fix me. It was about 6 o'clock, and I thought my husband would be home any minute, but he didn't come home right then, and this man kept getting uglier and uglier, and I saw I couldn't hold him off anymore. My pocketbook and my rings that I had taken off to get supper were lying on the shelf, but I didn't think much about it. I was worried because this man looked so tough and he talked so horribly. I made some excuse and I went out into the other room intending to phone for the police. But I met my husband coming in and I told him, and right away he got his revolver out of the desk. And with an awful yell, he charged out into the kitchen to drive this man out of the house. The man must have heard him coming, because when I got there, I saw the man was standing with his hands over his head, and my husband told me, search him, make sure he hadn't stolen anything out of the place. Then all of a sudden, the man turned red and blue in the face and began to cough and doubled up on the floor, and he writhed something awful. So my husband got scared. He thought maybe we better not call the police, as that would mean a lot of unpleasant publicity, and we couldn't stand that. And so I said, we better take him around the corner to the doctors as fast as possible. The man was still alive when we got there, we thought. But all of a sudden, I realized he was dead. And Herman, that's my husband, he said we better not have any dead men with us. So we put him on the bench at the top of the steps and ran away. Nobody heard us or saw us.
Uh-huh.
Said Cassidy, scowling and gnawing on his cigar.
Just as I thought. He must have stuck your ring in his mouth to hide it, and then choked on it. And now you,
he said, turning to the janitor.
Honest, it was just like I said.
Quavered the old man.
Except I thought I guess I made it sound kind of wild because I just touched him and down the steps he went. And then, being scared on account of thinking I killed him, I carried him out to the back myself before anybody saw him and dumped him over the garden wall into the next court.
Cassidy's scowl was most terrible to behold, and the janitor folded into himself like an accordion. Cassidy's glare passed on to the Greek, and the Greek, who had been fully prepared for this onslaught, immediately lost all his wits. He stammered and kneaded his pudgy fingers and shuffled his feet.
come on, out with it. Just what did you do?
The Greek whimpered.
I didn't mean any harm. It was just like I said. I was so scared I raised my knife when he hit my back. I let him have it. I saw his gun. Honest, I saw it. And I thought he was going to shoot me.
How about that gun?
thundered Cassidy. Lindsay averted his gaze.
I thought maybe it'd look bad if I had a gun in the house, so I put it in his pocket.
Go on.
The Greek marshaled his courage again and said,
I knew if I called the police, then my business might be ruined. So I thought maybe it'd be best. Perhaps if I just took him down the block and stood him up against a lamppost. I shoved his gun back in his pocket, but his coat was torn and it wouldn't stay. And then I beat it.
And you?
cried Cassidy to the bookkeeper.
Honest, I didn't mean nothing. But a couple of fellows that I owe money to said they'd get me. And I touched this guy when I came around the corner, and he sort of slumped at me. I guess he sort of slumped at me. I thought he jumped. Honest, I thought he did. And so I socked him in the jaw, and the gun clattered, and he kept leaning into me, and I kept slugging him. And finally, he almost had me down, and then there was the gun, so I shot him.
Cassidy patrolled the bullpen for 5 minutes. 5 sets of eyes followed him anxiously. Finally, Cassidy came to a decision in the case. He couldn't hold 5 people for one death, and you couldn't hold a man for defending his own house, especially when the dead man had actually committed a sort of suicide. They would all have to explain themselves later, but the judge would let them off. Cassidy himself couldn't see any crime except their failure to call in the police, and that was small enough. Careful Cassidy had solved it at last. He up-tilted his cigar, adjusted his bowler, and for once he smiled. Because, after all, the situation was funny.
Go on home, you people. Go on. Clear out.
He ordered. They went, talking excitedly among themselves, immensely relieved. In the squad room, Cassidy told them the story. Brant was still there, and Brant laughed hardest of all. Careful Cassidy beamed. They weren't laughing at him. They were laughing with him.
For a while,
said Careful Cassidy,
it looked like I'd have to arrest every man in town. Lucky I came along when I did, or I would have had to, I guess.